Well, good morning. As Göran said, it's been my pleasure to come here a number of times, in fact, many times. Stockholm is one of my favorite places to visit, so it's a pleasure to feel a little bit coming home. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting Joe and I here. It's a special privilege to come and talk to you all and to give you at least a glimpse into what we call remote viewing. And maybe by the end of tomorrow, you will have some experience yourself of doing this. While you'll hear about certain experts, remote viewers, like Joe and others this morning, and you'll see some examples, don't let that bother you, because there are experts out there among you. And by the end of this weekend, you'll know what we're talking about. If at any time I'm speaking too rapidly, slow me down, and I'll try to recover. So Joe and I are going to give you a team presentation of a brief overview of what the current status of remote viewing is in research and some of the applications that Joe and I did and others for the U.S. government. First off, I'll start with the definition of remote viewing. You're probably familiar with these terms: extrasensory perception, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, remote viewing, and so on. The problem with those terms, from our point of view, is they imply a mechanism of some kind. Extrasensory perception. Is it extra? Is it really a sensory perception? Who knows? And similarly, there are problems with all these terms. So we tried to invent a new term which, in fact, describes what it is we actually see in the laboratory. And that term is anomalous cognition. Cognition from the Latin, basically to understand, to have a realization, to understand something, and anomalous meaning in ways we currently, and I emphasize currently, don't understand. So that's what we see. People get some idea about something in ways we don't understand. That's the observable. And other people call that ESP and telepathy and so on. Well, clearly, we didn't invent this idea. It's been around for many years. Laboratories worldwide. Our laboratory began in 1972. J.B. Rhine, Professor Rhine at Duke University, began serious research in the 1930s. But my goodness, humans have been having these kinds of experiences ever since we could talk to each other or write on the walls of caves. So it's nothing new. What is relatively new is we've dragged these experiences as best we can into the laboratory and tried to understand them. So this is an outline of how an experiment might run. It takes 4 people to do a serious research quality laboratory trial of remote viewing. And here are 2 of them. We've called this person the receiver, someone who's going to be the remote viewer. This person is someone who's going to interview this person, called a monitor. And say at 10 o'clock in the morning, like now, these people are sitting in a locked room somewhere, let's say in California. At 10:05, the computer uses a random number generator to pick one photograph out of a predefined collection. In our case, here today and this weekend, we have 300 of them hiding out inside the computer. There's an example. Taj Mahal. That's not a real part of our target system, so don't have images of the Taj Mahal in your head when we get around doing remote viewing. And at this point in time, neither this person nor this person have any idea whatsoever about which target was chosen randomly. They may, in fact, know all of 300 of them. And in principle, although we never do it this way, these people could have all 300 photographs laid out on the table in front of them. We never do it that way, but scientifically, that is the assumption. Clearly, however, neither of these people know which one the computer chose. That's called a double-blind arrangement. So that frees this monitor to interview her what is in her mind with regard to this photograph that was chosen. In some fraction of the time, a small miracle happens. That my computer works, actually. In some fraction of the time, this woman will have a mental image picture and be able to draw it and write it on a piece of paper, a reasonable facsimile of what the actual target was. And at the end of the trial, we tell the person how well they did or how well they didn't do. It's called feedback. None of this, of course, is a scientific analysis of how well or how not well she has done. So how would we analyze this data? And you're going to get a chance to do it yourself. Here's some real data. This is some data that I took with an Apple computer company engineer. This person was a computer expert, had no idea of extrasensory perception or remote viewing. In fact, he thought the whole idea was rather stupid. But this is what he drew. I'm translating here the scribbling. It says intersection, notch or groove, and he drew that. He said wave, seawall, looking down, gap. Now, I can challenge Joe or me or any of you to tell me, well, what do you think the picture is based on that? Any suggestions? Shaking your head no is the right answer. Yes?
Could it be the seawalls in London?
Could be. It's not. Good guess, though. In fact, I'm glad you'll get your pay after the meeting because you asked just the right question for my next slide. Thank you. The point I'm trying to make here is remote viewing is a terrible way of getting information. It's even worse than the telephone system in California, and that's really saying something. So it's not surprising at all that you couldn't tell what the picture is based on that. Okay, so how would you analyze this? Here's a smaller picture of what we just saw. And here are 5 potential pictures, one of which, no kidding, one of which is the actual intended photograph that this person was trying to remote view when he produced these drawings. So an analyst, you, or generally my job, is to try to do a very difficult thing. Which one of these 5 pictures best matches this picture? This is called rank order analysis. Which one best matches? Then, having decided which one is the best match, you then say, what is the second best match? Third and fourth and so on. So, it's not as easy as you think. Here it says wave, and thank you for your question. And there's waves. Here it says sea wall. And there, well, it's not really a sea wall. It's a wall of rock, and it's got water running down. Well, you know, is remote viewing that good? Who knows? Here's an X. Well, there's something that looks very much like looking down on a city block. All right, let's have a show of hands. Which of you think this is the best match for that target? Nobody? We should go. We're done. Bye. None of you think that? Okay, how about this one? You've seen this before. I know. How about that one? Anybody? This one? Good. That one? Thank you. Köszönöm. So the question then is, you all got it right. That was, oh, come on, my computer isn't working too well. That one was the correct answer. But you wouldn't have known that in advance. This is a typical quality remote viewing for people that have never done this before. And sometimes even for people that have done it a lot. Right? So, I want to, in a sense, lower your expectations. Joe will speak more about this in a moment. Remote viewing is not a multimedia extravaganza going on in your head that you simply have to describe.
The way this would be used, for instance, in an intelligence problem would be you might have an idea on where an agent might be hiding, and you might want to find them. And that idea might encompass 5 or 8 locations, but you might not know exactly where that agent is. But a remote viewer might be able to give you sufficient information to send you to the proper location the first time, so you don't have to search all 8 locations. Or if you're looking for a weapon of mass destruction and you don't have but 4 hours to look, you want to be looking in the right place first. So a remote viewer might give you enough information to be looking in the right place first versus wasting your time looking in the first 3 places in the wrong place. You understand?
You'll see an example of that with one of the work that we did for one of our military clients, testing this idea against directed energy beam weapons. And you'll see an example of exactly how it would be used precisely the way Joe just said. I won't bore you with a lot of statistics, but to keep my scientist friend sitting out here in the front row will keep me honest. This is the statistics of this particular study from this industrial setting, and all the statistics mean it worked, and it worked significantly. Okay, Joe, I'm going to have you take over here. This is Joe's lucid dreaming trial. Let me give a background briefly on lucid dreaming. Are you familiar with the concept of lucid dreaming? You know, where people have a dream and then are able to signal by moving their eyes that they know that they're dreaming. That's called a lucid dream. And we thought this would be a great way to improve the quality of the remote viewing. And this is one trial that we did out of 21 where Joe was the viewer. I'll do that. Go ahead.
Basically, what we did this experiment in a sleep lab with Stephen LaBerge at Stanford University. And I was wired up to some monitor equipment, EEG, and they were able to monitor me as I went to sleep. So they watched me go through the sleep spindles into REM sleep, so they knew when I was actually sleeping. And as I began dreaming, I was able to see that I was actually asleep and in a dream and awake and aware. And the way that's done is in your dream, as you begin dreaming and you become aware, you can stand in your dream perfectly still and look over your left and right shoulders very rapidly 4 times in your dream. And what happens is, on your REM node that they're monitoring, small spikes will appear. And that's because the outer muscles of your eyes are not paralytic in your sleep. And that shows up as little spikes. So they become aware by monitoring your REM that you're asleep, dreaming, and awake and aware. Isn't that interesting? So at that point, they would generate a target for me that I was supposed to be pursuing in my dream state. So the idea was that I would do remote viewing while I was asleep and dreaming in a lucid dream state to see if it would improve my remote viewing. Interesting concept. The problem is, when I was asleep and dreaming and became aware and then knew I was supposed to find this target, I was dreaming on a country road in the middle of nowhere. So I had no idea where the lab was. So I decided what I would do in my dream is, instead of going to the lab and looking at the picture, I would actually go to the target. So in my dream, I invented the target, and I actually went to it and walked around in the target. And what I came up with was this barn in the middle of a valley, or a cabin or whatever, and I said it was surrounded by what I perceived to be alpine mountains. And I said I felt like it was in the American Rockies or maybe in the Alps. And this was the actual result of the remote viewing. This was the target picture. And it actually had a little cabin down here. And Ed got mad at me because he pointed out the fact that I missed the automobile parked next to the cabin. We had some very interesting results. One of the problems with lucid dreaming, however, is you have this problem that starts occurring after a number of lucid dreams. It's called false awakening. It's where you think you wake up, but you don't. You just re-enter another lucid dream. So you begin to wonder whether or not you're really awake. I couldn't tell whether or not I was awake or asleep after a while. And that's when you start knowing what people experience when they're going crazy.
Well, I'll add a science note to that. More importantly, from our perspective, we wanted to know whether someone who could do lucid dreaming, whether this would improve overall the quality. And while this is certainly impressive, I mean, it's one of the best remote viewings I've seen. Nonetheless, statistically, it was no better than doing it in a waking state.
You actually have more control in the waking state.
Right. So we abandoned it as a procedure, thank goodness, because none of us wanted to stay up all night while these guys get to sleep on the job. Yes, you have a question?
I just wanted to say that we have the target onto the picture.
That's correct.
And was this in the night or in the day?
The target?
Now, when we're doing the lucid dream, was it in the night?
It was in the nighttime.
So, but still you could see clearly for start. I mean, how could you explain what you mean when you said you went to the target and not to the photo?
When I went to the target, it was in the daytime. I went to the target as it's perceived exactly during the photograph. So I don't even know what the date time was that I was at the target. It could have been when the photograph was taken. Because in remote viewing, time is not material. You can go past, present, and future, which I'll talk about later.
Keeping us honest, this was 21 trials. It's an odd number, but it was just determined by the availability of our participants. And the effect size, the overall study was significant, but the size, how strong the effect was, called the effect size, was is actually somewhat lower than what we see in the waking state in the laboratory. So we abandoned the procedure. This is just a chart put together by Jessica Utz, a professor of statistics, University of California. Here's the reference, and afterwards, if you want it, I can get it for you. This is from 1991, so it's now a bit out of date, but it was her analysis of all the remote viewing in Gonsfeld to that date, and she comes up with, yes, statistically, it seems to be a valid phenomenon of some sort. And here at that time are some publications in the so-called mainstream literature describing these results. Now, Joe, and to a much lesser degree myself, working with Joe, have done some on-camera remote viewings. A media person will come and say, gee, we'd like to do this remote viewing on for television, and we want to do it as technically interesting as possible, yet at the same time making sure that it's a scientifically valid approach. And you'll see some of examples of that. To date, Joe has produced, something like 86 on-camera remote viewings for national and international television. Japan, England,
Germany, England, Holland, America,
Hungary. Okay. 70 of them qualitatively are excellent. If they had been judged, most of them were not, they would have been easily matched as a first-place match. These were not experiments, these were demonstrations. You'll see an example of one such study we did last February for the National Geographic people that we actually did judge it in a scientifically valid way. A recent example is this National Geographic. In this case, everybody was blind to everything. They spent a fair amount of money coming to our laboratory in California to make sure that no one could cue Joe or the camera people didn't know. Everything was hidden from everybody. And the protocol is we had someone from the production company choose 6 locations within 30 kilometers of our laboratory in California. And they did all kinds of things to make sure that people handling the targets couldn't send a subtle message to people doing the judging, so there were independent target pools and so on. And we performed a blind rank order analysis just like you saw a moment ago. And the result was high quality correspondence, and I was able to pick the correct target in a blind way that was used in the study. Here are the 6 targets. This is the end of a large bridge across San Francisco Bay. This is a rock quarry, a little airport in Palo Alto, California. This is a boat marina on San Francisco Bay near Palo Alto. This is Stanford University American football stadium. And this is a large redwood tree in a park nearby. The young woman who put this together had come to my lab a day or two in advance, so I gave her a day-long short course on how to pick targets that were as different from one another as possible, and she did a reasonably decent job, I thought. Yeah. So, one of these was chosen at random. That one turned out to be the target. And of course, when Joe and I were doing the interview, none of us knew that. And so here are a series of summaries that Joe put in his responses. I'll just put them all up. Unique access, tunnel-like passage, access under an overpass, building adjacent to what she's handling, she being the outbound experimenter, a woman who actually went and stood there at the time of the remote viewing. Garden, formal garden, fills a small area. Paths, both formal and straight lines, informal. Central work of art, that's important. Half arches. Target stands alone in a clearing with trees. Smooth, rough metal, stone. Large, looks up at it. He means that Rachel, the outbound person, was actually looking up at this site. This is what you go through to get to the target. It's a tunnel under the bridge, and she was standing around the other side. Here's a path, a tunneling effect, first impression. That was the first thing out of Joe's mouth when we started the remote viewing session. Here are a couple of shots. This is the end of the bridge. Here's a manicured area with, I wouldn't go so far to call that a formal garden. I would call it a formal scrubby patch of brush. Supposed to be a formal garden, but we have no water. And this is what he drew, an area like that. I think I have some arrows on this. There's this path area. Here's a work of art, which is a picture describing the origin of the bridge. And high overhead, heavy, massive, there's the bridge. Based on that material, I was able to get the correct which one of 6 was involved here. So, Joe, why don't you take over on this, and I'll scoot along. Yes?
I saw this program from National Geographic. I was actually sent to the Norwegian television.
Oh, my.
And did you like the commentary, the way the program was commented?
How can I answer that and be polite at the same time? The short answer is no. I didn't like the commentary.
Unscientific, you didn't talk about 6 targets, it's just they discussed 1 target.
Right. What he's talking about, the National Geographic showed this in the U.S., and both Joe and I were rather upset because they described this experiment and said it was not controlled. My goodness, this is one of the most controlled public experiments ever. What they should have said, it is not proof of extrasensory perception, which I would say, yes, that's true. It's not proof of extrasensory perception. It could have been my lucky guess with a 1/6 probability. Had they said that, I would have no problem with it. Instead, they made it look like this was silly science by a bunch of amateurs, and I was rather upset about that. We're going to write a nasty letter to the National Geographic. That plus $5 or $6 will buy you coffee at an expensive restaurant. Yeah.
everyone knows that a single experiment's never proof of anything. Yeah, and it could have said that. That could have been a nice, healthy conclusion by any skeptical person. But to say that it wasn't good science was really a slap in the face. Missing persons in Japan. I've made 13 trips to Japan in 2.5 years, and the targets that Japanese have been giving me are missing people. And doing missing persons is probably the toughest thing you can do with remote viewing, because finding missing people move a lot, and people that don't want to be found are almost impossible to find. And using remote viewing to find missing people is probably the toughest thing you can use it for. The way it works, the Japanese send a film crew to Virginia, which is where I live, in central Virginia, and they set the cameras up in my dining room. And the film crew brings a sealed envelope, and in the sealed envelope is the name of the individual and their birth date. And these are people that have been missing from 7 to 35 years. And no one in the family has any idea where they are. No relative, no one. They just disappeared off the face of the planet. In some cases, the police have looked for them from 7 to 10 years, or a detective agency. Some of the best detective agencies in Japan have been paid to look for them. And no one's been able to locate them or find them. And my job is to sit in front of the cameras, and the first thing I have to do is describe them. So if it's a male and they're known to be 68 years of age, and I start describing a 39-year-old female, obviously I'm not on target. So the first thing I have to do is describe the person in the envelope. And if I'm able to describe the person in the envelope, then they presume that everything I say afterwards must be accurate. If I don't describe the person in the envelope, they discard it, and I move on to the next target. I bring 3 people usually. I usually end up doing 3 remote viewings. Some of them are wrong, by the way. But once in a while I get lucky. They're always double blind. They take the information, they return to Japan. They turn it all over to the best detective agency in Tokyo. That detective agency takes that information, and they spend 30 days to 3 months looking for the individual using only the information provided by remote viewing. And sometimes they get lucky. About 38% of the time, they actually find the person, which is really amazing, and the person's reunited. Then I get to see the person when I go to Japan for what they call the chat show portion of the program. And we get to see the person reunited with their loved one. There's been 50 sessions involving missing people so far. 26 out of 50, I'm sorry, I've done 50 sessions for television. 26 of them involve missing people. And 10 of the sessions of 26, I found the missing people. So it's a 38.5%.
Yeah, Joe, I don't know if you can comment on this in a general way, but how much effort was put in beforehand by the detective agencies to find this?
None. In fact, the detective agency, when I did the first missing person, the detective agency got very argumentative about dealing with psychic information. They said, no, we don't work with psychic information. And they had to actually pay them a huge amount of money in the studio to get the detective agency to deal with it. Now the detective agency likes working with my information because it seems to work well. The detective agency doesn't do anything until they get my folder. They take only my information, then go out and do the work. There's no information that's done otherwise.
What I meant to say is that the search itself, if the information is sort of general enough, might aid them to find.
Oh, I'm going to show you an example of that. Here's an example of a missing person. This one just occurred. This has happened in the last show I just did in Japan. There was a 89-year-old woman, an elderly woman, and her son had disappeared 16 years prior. He just vanished. and no one in the family had any idea what happened to her. She just completely disappeared. She was not feeling well. She had some illness, and she was afraid that she was going to die without seeing her son. It was her only son. And in Japan, this is critically important, that the male son see their mother before they die. And so she had asked the studio if they would ask me to find her son for her, because she had watched me on the television a number of times. So they asked if I would intercede and find this person in the seal envelope. So the description I gave was that he was 37 years of age, plus or minus. He had lines in his face, and he had a thin face. The age was 38, so I was off a year. I said 140 to 145 pounds, that was correct. 5'5" or 6, walked with a pronounced slouch, correct. Correct on the weathering, exposure. I said, this is really important. I said he was handicapped, left leg and limp badly. In Japan, that's a really serious condition because people who are handicapped can't get work. If you can't get work in Japan, that's a matter of shame. It's a loss of face. And that's critical in Japan because then that disrupts the family unity, because if you have shame, you don't go home. And that was one of the problems. He wouldn't go home and become a burden on his mother, especially if she's elderly. So that was a condition of why he didn't go home. Correct on the hair color, correct on the glasses, correct on his being unkempt and unshaven. I said something about a white shirt and brown jacket, which was incorrect. One shoe on his right foot. I thought maybe his left foot was in a cast or something, which is why he was limping. That turned out to be wrong. Did not inform the family member of the mishap. That turned out to be correct. Then I do a drawing. After I've described the individual, I do the first drawing. The first drawing is to describe the city. I try to do a layout of the city. I put mountains in. I do an area of the old city and the new city, because in Japan, there's always an old part and a new part. That helps describe the city. I lay out where it is on the water. So it's just a general area of the city. Based on this and subsequent drawings, the actual city is identified as a harbor city. And they said it was maybe Nagoya.
Oops, sorry.
That's wrong. The next thing I do is, the first thing is I draw in the main train station of the city. And from the main train station, I always put in railways as I perceive them. I put in main highways. Then I always put in subway lines. And then I draw major parks, temples, and I put in main building locations, like here, and I think there's one here. And I put a little garden behind that building. I always put in all the main things that I can perceive. And it looks really easy when I'm doing it. This is 2 hours of labor right here in front of cameras. It's piecing together a holographic picture of the city. What I try to do is paint enough of the picture here in a pattern so that they can match it to an overlay of a city somewhere in Japan and say, this has got to be Osaka, this has got to be Nagoya, this has got to be, one of the main cities. So they get a general area.
Can I add a comment here? There are two ways in which you might approach this. You could go to Joe and say, okay, we're missing this guy, here's a map, put a pin in the map, and tell us where the guy is. That almost never works. That's very hard to do. The second approach is what you're hearing Joe tell you about now, and that's basically remote viewing with an outbound experimenter who happens to be lost. That's precisely the kind of thing that we do for a living. And so what Joe tries to do is to describe the areas well enough that someone who's familiar with the area can then go and recover the person.
Piece it together in some way. So then after adding all these things in here, then they can sort of generally match the area of the target to a city. Oops, back up one. The accuracy in the drawing is actually about 70%. It's not totally accurate, but it's enough to identify the city. And the location of the tower, the hotel, the white structure, blue plastic tents, and main train station is about 95% accurate. So where I put the actual items is more accurate than the overall pattern. which is important. The blue plastic tents, when I start talking about blue plastic tents and homeless shelters, that makes the Japanese very nervous because they don't like talking about their homeless. And when I start talking about homeless tents right next to the major white structure, that happens to be, I didn't know it at the time, but that happens to be a very formal castle in Nagoya. That's like one of their prime structures. And to say there's a big homeless city next to it was like really making them nervous. They didn't believe that for a second. So that's critical information, because they weren't believing any of this that I was telling them. So then when I had identified a tower, so they said, okay, can you draw a picture of that tower? So I drew this picture of the tower. And what's important about it is all towers in Japan are different, because when they build towers, they like to make it their tower. Each city wants their own identifiable tower. So towers are really important. And this structure right here in the tower, you can see it in this tower. That's really different. That's what identifies this tower in Nagoya. And so as soon as they saw me drawing this tower, they were able to identify the city positively as Nagoya. This hotel is interesting because not only because of the design of the hotel, but I put a huge garden behind it. Land is so prime in Japan. Nobody ever puts a huge garden behind a hotel. That's like impossible. But there, you can see this major garden right behind this hotel. It's like very unusual. So then I was beginning to feel a lot more confident about this target. I was beginning to feel a lot better about where this stuff was coming together. My mind was getting a much better holistic picture. I drew in a river. I was telling them, okay, the way you get to this sort of tent city where this man's probably living as a homeless person, it's out by this big white structure on this hill, and it's down by this river. So to get there from the main train station, you want to take this main highway, but you got to take this first exit before this turn, because if you don't take this exit, you're going to go west. And there's no exit for like 11 miles. So I told them how to get off and go to this main park where this white building was, which is over here, and I gave them a parking area. Got to tell them how to get there in Japan. Go ahead. This is the building I drew. Now that looks pretty good, but it's not exactly correct. You can see this is a lot more complex. That took like 5 or 6 drawings. I kept redrawing it and crumpling up the paper and trying to decide, because it was never quite right. So in remote viewing, there's this perception that in remote viewing you're actually seeing something. You're seeing a picture of the building. You're not. You're never seeing anything. You're feeling it. You're tasting it. And you're trying to put that taste into a picture. So you're tasting the intersecting roof lines and the very complexity of the building, and you're trying to make it into a building. And that becomes a very difficult thing when you're trying to translate what you're tasting about a target into a picture. And I'll explain that later in my presentation. It's a very difficult thing to do, because there's this perception that you actually have a vision, but you don't most of the time. 90% of the time you don't have visions of the target. You're trying to make a feeling into a vision. That's a hard thing to do.
That's why we try to get away from the term remote viewing, because it implies a vision.
Yeah, and so that's a misconception. You should not think or expect that you will have a vision.
So, because I have another question, when you started with this map, you said that you were the alignment. And that was what I was thinking, because if you have seen that, you can't see on a person that you is 37 years old. So you have...
I feel his age.
But how does that come across, and how do you perceive the age of 37?
Older people feel different from younger people, to me. And it comes from experience. It comes from just doing this over and over and over. I've been doing this 27 years. And it's from practice.
So it's like a certain feeling connected with the maturity of what
Yes.
or something like that.
Yes. It's a maturity feeling. And sometimes, and I'm wrong. A lot of times I'm wrong.
I have another question when it comes to that, because you said it's almost the most hardest thing to do to find a missing person, to find a person. But on the other hand, you were finding agents that were hiding. What is the difference? Because as it is a feeling, isn't it easier than to find a person than in a building that you as a human are maybe not responding as you usually human? Do you understand what I mean?
It's just as easy to find an object as it is to find a human. It's just as easy to look for somebody who doesn't want to be found as it is to find somebody who doesn't care. It's difficult to find somebody who's moving simply because of the time window. But if you understand that, you can plan for targeting somebody 3 days ahead of time so that you're waiting for them when they arrive.
But then it's precognition.
Yeah.
That's correct. Then it's precognition. That's not so difficult. It's complex, but it's not so difficult. Okay, when I was asked directly at the end of the remote viewing, where is this city? That's what they said to me. Joe, if you had to put this city on a map of Japan, where would you put it? I said, in relation to Tokyo, I put Osaka here, Tokyo here. I said I would put it right in the middle. And that's approximately where Nagoya is. That's not actually where it is, but it's approximately where Nagoya is. I also drew a picture of a Shinto shrine. I said it was very old. I said it was very important. It's one of the most important Shinto shrines in Japan, and it was in that city. That was never found. They never found it. They looked for it, but they never found it. So it may have existed at one time in the city and it burned. Or it's still there and they never found it.
Or you made it up.
Or I invented it. And they haven't built it yet. Now, the detective agency in Tokyo used my material to positively identify Nagoya's location. They actually found the tent city right next to the castle. They were stunned to find it there. They went to the tent city and they met people there. The man did not live in the tent city, but he had. He had lived there many weeks before and had been relocated to a housing area for homeless. And so they sent the TV crew and the detective agency to the housing area, and they were able to locate him in the housing area. So he was reunited with his elderly mother, who was 89. Now here's the interesting part. 16 years earlier, he had been hit by a car, and no one in his family had known that. And as a result of the accident, developed gangrene in his left leg, and had his left leg amputated just above the knee. And because of the accident and the loss of his leg, had refused to go home because he didn't want to become a burden on his mother, and disappeared into the homeless community. It was really fascinating to see the reunion with his parents, with his mother. So they celebrated her 89th birthday.
During the process, get the impression that the person doesn't want to be localized, in contrast to the wishes of his family, and maybe even you have $1 million reward from the TV company. How would you proceed?
That's occurred. There's been 2 occasions when I got the sense that this person didn't want to be found, and I've just terminated a remote viewing. I've stopped and said, we don't need to go any further on this, or it would be inappropriate to find this person. and the studio's been very cooperative, and they've just put it aside. In other words, I've taken failure for it. There's times, and this occurred in Stargate as well, in the military, when I've been asked to do something as a remote viewer, and I knew it was not the right thing to do, and so I just failed. I just was not successful. And there are times when you're asked to provide information, and you provide only a certain amount of information because it answers the question, and there's a whole lot of other information, but you just don't provide it because it's not necessary, or it would invade the privacy of someone, or it's not pertinent. Just because you have it doesn't mean it's necessary to give it. You understand?
If we push the issue a bit further, and suppose there's some criminal, or anyway, someone that the society decides is criminal, do you have the ability to decide the absolute truth? If
Sure.
the person is to be localized or not?
That's correct. I still have my feelings. See, when it comes to morality, you cannot delegate morality. You can't give that to somebody else, that responsibility to someone else. There's this perception that you can delegate morality to someone and let them take that responsibility. You can't do that. Not in my world. In my world, responsibility for morality, you have to retain that no matter what. So all my decisions for my morality and my what's right and wrong for me, I have to retain that. I cannot give that to anybody for any reason. So I have to make those decisions, no matter what somebody tells me. Mm-hmm.
But Steve, when you said that you failed, you mean that you couldn't see it?
No, I mean that I could be successful, I choose not to be. So there are times that I just fail on purpose.
So you don't feel like it's when it's really, really, really wrong, that you actually can't see it?
Oh yeah, there's times. No, there's times when I just fail. But there's times when I just feel I shouldn't succeed. I should not be successful here. I should just walk away from this. It's not right to do this. You understand? Okay.
It's an ethical question, not a remote viewing question.
Right. And ethics always come first. That's always the first question. Hmm?
So could you say that remote viewing is all about empathy?
All about what?
Empathy.
Empathy?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
It sounds like that when you explain.
Sure.
Explain like this.
Sure.
But I must ask anyway, when it comes to ethics, I mean, if you really think hard about it, how are you, for example, how are you possible, or how do you have the knowledge? You can't have the knowledge to do the right ethical judgment because you don't have all the facts. It's impossible. So that must just be a feeling. It can't be from logic because no one has the facts to become judgment.
Well, no one ever has all the facts.
No.
You know, you can collect facts all the time and never have all the information. You can only hope that you get enough information. And always, no matter how much information you collect, you still have what's in here. And everybody walks around with alarm bells inside them. It's just that some people... Yeah, we need to move on now. Yeah, we can save the questions during the talk.
Have I got it right that you never receive a complete picture of the situation? You never see the person or when
Absolutely.
That you are working step for step. You have an impression of the width, of the length, and so on. So you work step for step. Is it so?
Yes, I build step by step on just information from my mind.
Is it a personal style of you, your way to work, or do you think it's for all remote viewers to work like this step for step? Or do you think there are some who just see the whole picture?
In remote viewing, in the remote viewing protocol, it's necessary that you be blind to the target. Psychics, on the other hand, will sometimes work from a picture or work from other information, which is different.
I want to put a little bit into perspective. The examples you've seen are really high quality and excellent, and I'm going to show you a couple of more now. But Joe will agree that we're showing you the best evers. Yeah. That if you ask how good is this in the laboratory, and I'm not speaking about, maybe 4,500 trials in our laboratory over the years. We've worked together since 1978. If you look at that entire history, good, bad, and indifferent with Joe, chance is 20%, because we always choose 1 in 5, and he's a little under 50%, which statistically is extraordinary. But only about 20% of that data is of the quality you've just seen here. And the other problem is, we don't know in advance, we have no indicator whatsoever that a particular piece of remote viewing is the good one until we get the answer. And that has been a frustration in our program since its inception. And if any of you have any creative ideas how to solve that problem, I am your slave forever. It's a difficult, difficult problem. Okay, so now 2 more knock your socks off examples. One of the problems the military had with us was, what can we use remote viewing for? And so part of our job was to learn ourselves, because we had no idea either during the course of the long program for the government. But one of the things the military was interested in during the Cold War, is the bad guys, whoever they are, might have directed energy beam weapons. You know, like from some science fiction program. Beam rays of particles or microwave shining on people to kill them and so on. And they wanted to know, would remote viewing work to help find those kinds of weapons? So we were asked on a couple of occasions, and you'll see them here. This used to be very classified and secret. It is no longer. And we were asked to try remote viewing against our own beam weapons, not the bad guys' beam weapons. Maybe we're the bad guys too, who knows? But we had our own set of weapons like that. And so they asked the intelligence community across the U.S. to use whatever techniques they had to try to find this particular U.S.-based exercise. And one of those people they asked to help find this exercise program was us. And so the way this worked was, we did 2 trials, one a year apart, and here's how it worked. We used receiver 372. That's a very secret person. I'm not going to tell you who that is. We were given the social security number of a person none of us had met. We were told that person would be continental somewhere in the USA at a particular date and at a particular time. And the person working with Joe did not know who the sponsor was, did not know who what the target system was, had no idea even what the framework was, whether I knew, because I was a project director, that it was a directed energy beam weapon, but I myself, at least on one of these cases, didn't know even where the target was. But the people interacting with Joe at all times had no idea about any of this, so it was really double blind. I won't go into this in detail, but there's a new way or a different way of analyzing the remote viewing, and it involves a mathematical technique called fuzzy set, and that sounds complicated, but the idea is very simple. The client, the sponsor, the military sponsor, defined what they meant of what the target system was. So they wanted to know how accurate would Joe be. And that makes sense. If he got most of their target correct, he would be very accurate. If he got hardly any of it, he wouldn't be so accurate. But if you think about it for a moment, accuracy is not sufficient to tell you whether remote viewing happened. Why? Because Joe could read the encyclopedia as his response and eventually mention everything. Guaranteed he'll have accuracy, no matter 100% accurate, no matter what the target is. So to guard against that, we invented another term based in this mathematics called reliability. And that means how reliable of a remote viewer is Joe. In other words, how much can we trust what he says? If he goes on and reads the Encyclopedia Britannica, and only one page of which is accurate, he is very unreliable, because most of the stuff he said is wrong. So this is a measure of what percentage of the remote viewing is correct. And so we have a reasonable number we call the figure of merit, which is the product of these two numbers. So to get a high figure of merit, you have to give a very accurate description of the target with not a lot of wrong information. So we did 2 trials a year apart, and here are their results. The first one, and you'll see examples of these in a moment, was a 50 million electron volt accelerator, an electron accelerator. And they were running the beam out on air. This particular one, I was actually on site along with the outbound experimenter, so I knew about it. And Joe, in the accuracy determined by the client, not me, said that Joe described 77% of what they wanted to know about the target. And 78% what he had to say was correct. So you don't have a good feeling, nor did I initially, of what those numbers actually mean. So we did a lot of work to try to find out anybody talking, describing any random site, what accuracy and reliability would you get with that? It turns out, roughly, about a third of what anybody says describes about a third of any place. So the figure of merit is 1/3 times 1/3, which is roughly 0.1, and Joe is about 0.6 about it. So this is really quite spectacular. However, this was not a formal experiment. This was just a demonstration to see whether remote viewing would work in these two directed energy weapon systems. And you'll see pictures in a moment. A year later, even I was surprised that the numbers are virtually consistent. Were you surprised?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. I'll let you take over the description if you want, or I'll do it.
Go ahead.
Okay. This is in part what Joe drew at the 8 o'clock session in the morning. He said there's an administration building, and he labeled it Building A, and this is T-shaped building here. He said there's a lab complex. There's a parking lot, trees, a city. And while he was drawing that, our target person was planning the experiment in the administration building at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. Now, unlike everything you've seen so far, I photographed this picture to match this one. This was not randomly chosen. But I've shown people this picture who know about the West Gate at Lawrence Livermore, and they said, oh, that's a picture of the West Gate at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory near San Francisco. And there are trees. You can see it's quite good. There are trees, and there are trees, parking lot, lab complex, and administration building. What I found interesting is the shape of the administration building is nearly accurate. He missed this part here, but there's little things on the top. He's got little things on the top and the right number of floors. Now, as Joe said a little earlier, if we really had a serious case and we're missing somebody, and Joe drew this, it would be accurate enough to go at least do the next step to find out whether it makes sense. And that's the real value of remote viewing. It is to give pointers and cues for other ways of finding stuff to collect the answer. At around 4 in the afternoon, our target person was driving to the overnight experiment, and this is all Joe drew. He said, single power poles, many. I'm just translating the writing here. Said, moving electricity in the form of a grid work. Halo, probably not visible to the naked eye, and he sort of sketched them. And while he was drawing that, our guy was driving right in the middle of that, which is a series of windmills out in the eastern part near San Francisco on the way to Livermore to the laboratory site, and it is exactly this. This is in part what Joe drew for the time the fellow was at the accelerator, and it's partially right. He said, among correct and incorrect things, this is a device to accelerate electrons. That's precisely correct. He has a beam diameter of 3 inches. It's actually about 0.3 of a millimeter. But it is a beam. And Joe developed a almost Star Trek scenario, very elaborate goodie, you know. It was quite an amazing thing. But a clue in remote viewing judgment. Here is a long transcript, and if the remote viewer is surprised in what they say, that is a clue to me, a judge, to pay attention to that. So here's a whole lot of things Joe's going on and says, wait a minute, this is a device to accelerate electrons. And then he went back talking about something else. That was a huge clue that that was correct, and in fact, it was correct. This is what the device actually looked like. It's a huge accelerator at Lawrence Livermore laboratory.
Now, in my defense, how is a remote viewer supposed to describe that?
I don't know. It's funny, but that's a serious problem. We had, with all due respect, I want to emphasize something else. Joe is only one of a fair number of people we've worked with for over the years. In fact, one person I've worked even longer than I have with Joe. And while he's magnificent, no question, I consider, with all due respect, sir, him as a national resource. But he's no better than some of the other people on the project. Some of these people are damn good also. And this other guy, I say that to emphasize that this isn't just a single personal phenomenon of this guy. You know, what would you say? There's probably, who knows, 0.5% of the population or something of that nature. A large number of people. And one of the challenges is, how do we find them? And we're working busily, almost on a day-to-day basis, to replace both of us. Because we're getting a little long in the tooth, as they say.
Speak for yourself, old man.
Yeah, right. But one of those other people was a fellow named Ingo Swan. And we, early on, asked him to do a remote viewing under double-blind conditions of a very large special laser system at Sylvania Corporation in Silicon Valley. And he says, well, this thing looks like a locomotive. I think it's a crematorium, and it smells like a swimming pool. So we took him to this device, which was about the size of a locomotive. It had fluorine gas as the laser material, and it did smell like chlorine or a swimming pool. And it produced a lot of light and heat, which reminded him of a crematorium. And he got, just what Joe said, really angry at us. He says, how the hell do you expect me to do? I'm standing here looking at it, and I don't know what I'm looking at. How can I look at it with remote viewing and tell you what it is? And that's actually a very serious and pressing problem. And so the answer is, we don't want you to tell us what it is. Just tell us your impression. And you will see in a moment how that would really pay off in the next example. Right? Yeah. Okay, this is, in no hesitation, this is one of the best remote viewings I've seen. I might as well just throw the whole thing up. I'll explain it here. This was in the deserts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is a large microwave generator. Not only will it cook your sandwich for lunch, it'll cook you along with it. It's very, very high power microwave generator. And what they were doing with it was destructive testing of electronics. And they had a whole lot of people in the intelligence community looking in by various technologies to see if they could sense this experiment. Huge bursts of high energy microwaves going out. And here's Joe's response to this. The same idea, we had the social security number of someone none of us had met. And Joe drew this thing here and said it's 6 by 4 centimeters. Well, I got it completely wrong. It's 6 by 4 inches. And had you looked at this drawing and knew nothing else, you'd say, oh, that's a microwave waveguide. For people who are technically oriented, this would cue you into saying, oh, maybe it's a microwave system. Let's use other intelligence collection techniques that are specialized for sensing microwaves and go back and look at this. That alone would be good enough. But here you see something that's very reminiscent of this microwave horn. And he said it's in a wrapped environment, and energy is coming out here. It's general effects testing overall evaluated. They were doing destructive testing of electronics with this beam. Measurement of shock waves are precisely correct. And I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, but it turns out this angle that Joe drew for this beam, whatever it was, is the actual beam angle of the radiation coming out of here. You didn't name it. Come on. There are very, very, very few cases that we did for the government that have been declassified. You'll hear a lot of things on the internet. Ignore them all. There's very little of it released. This one was released. This was done before my time on the project. It was done in 1972 by a remote viewer named Pat Price, who is no longer with us. And Pat drew this. He was targeted by giving the geographical coordinates of some place in Kazakhstan, a place called Semipalatinsk. And one point I want to make is that this was a strategic intelligence problem. The whole community had been worrying for years about what was going on at this secret place in then the Soviet Union. After the fact, years later, everybody got it wrong, including us. But nonetheless, everybody was quite worried about it at the time. So Pat was given the geographical coordinates, and he drew this crane. And he said, this is a huge crane. It can actually go across the top of a building, and a person would only reach half a wheel height. This is an artist rendition of a satellite photograph of the place. And here is a huge crane, which goes across the top of these buildings. And here is a man standing next to this crane. It's enormous. The CIA knew about this crane. And as Joe indicated earlier, this was a clue to them that Pat somehow was connected to the right place. Pat went on to produce a thick binder of material about this particular site, some of which was correct. Enough of it was correct to convince the intelligence community to continue on with the work. So this was a seminal early 1972 example. This is from the Washington Post newspaper in Washington, D.C. shortly after it was announced that we were doing this for the military. And to my knowledge, no other cases have been formally released. And during the break, if you wish, Joe can talk about some of these, because I believe you were the viewer on all of them. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I think we have time, is that right?
Yes, 20 minutes more.
Excellent. We'll do a little bit of science. What you've seen is a background about how we collect the data, how it was applied in the intelligence world, how it was applied in modern world to help find missing people, a little bit about the old days. Now this is some science to give you an overview. This is a one-slide lesson in astronomy. You may know that it always takes two angles to define where you are on the surface of a sphere, latitude and longitude on the Earth. Astronomers use two other angles called declination and right ascension that are similar to be able to point to where a star is. And so by definition, this right ascension angle here is what's called local sidereal time. That is, the moment when you face north and south, I don't know where that is, there's a line directly overhead, And the ascension value of that line, which changes moment to moment, is called the local sidereal, meaning star, time. This is nothing we invented. Astronomers and navigators use this routinely. So, mainly with the work from my colleague James Spottiswoode, what he called me up one day, it's kind of amusing. I don't know if you guys know this or not. He called me up and said, Ed, please don't laugh, but I've been looking at the data of our field, and I found a strong correlation with local sidereal time. And of course I immediately laughed. I said, look, I have enough trouble selling remote viewing to the military without stirring in astrology. And he said, no, it's not astrology, this is astronomy. And so he started telling me about this, and it is our way of doing things that when we see something like I'm about to show you, we say, this has to be wrong. It cannot be correct. Come on, James, you've screwed up somewhere. Let's try to find it. He says, yeah, I'm sure this is wrong. We'll find it shortly. Now, what he says is, with about 1,500 remote viewing trials spread out over 20 years from laboratories all over the Earth, what he found is he plotted them at the local sidereal time at which the remote viewing trial was conducted. And on this axis, what you see is how good the remote viewing was. So there's some wiggles, and all of a sudden, somewhere around 13.5, there's this great big peak. And somewhere around 18, there's this hole. 0 means no remote viewing. What this graph suggests, if it is true, is that over hundreds and hundreds of trials for 20 years worldwide, there is no evidence of remote viewing at 18 hours local sidereal time. Boy, if that's right, that's a biggie. And if this is true, at 13 hours, my goodness, you get an enormous enhancement over the average if you do your remote viewing at 13.5 hours local sidereal time. This is not your clock time, mind you. It is your clock time at only one date. I think that's September 21st or something like that, the equinox. So I said, okay, James, this is silly. Let's prove it that it's wrong. Let's go collect a lot of data, new data from our colleagues that is not existing in this plot. So we went to all of our colleagues and said, hey, do you have any data that we don't have yet? Oh, yeah. Well, turns out we had about another 1,300 or so. And for the most part, it overlays. Not bad. Certainly the main feature overlays, a peak here and a hole here, and this is a lot of noise down in this center. So wait a minute. Now it's getting more interesting. This is brand new data. The blue curve is the hypothesis. The red curve is the check on that hypothesis. It's not bad. And this is currently the status today. If you look at various laboratories, Adrian Parker did some work in Gonsfeld, and his data overlays in this curve. It's a lot noisier because there's less data. Daryl Bem, same thing. All the individual labs sort of lie on this curve. We don't know what it is. But Joe's a great remote viewer, and he didn't indicate to you, but when he goes remote viewing, and goes sort of out of his body, I can give him a camera. That's the best way we collect data. And so I sent him on a trip to go photograph our galaxy from far above. And here's a representation of our galaxy. That's not really our galaxy, but it looks like ours. And if it were our galaxy, we could lay over it. You know, these things are spinning disks. And so I have here a coordinate system on the disk. And so this is X and Y, and there's coming out of the plane of the galaxy. And if this were our galaxy, Earth would be out here in one of the arms. So it turns out, just an observation, that if you do a remote viewing at a time, that the local sidereal time is such, when you walk outside and look up toward the southern sky, and your gaze is looking right at Sagittarius, or where the center of our galaxy is, the right ascension value of your gaze corresponds to that hole. What is that suggestive? It says, if you do remote viewing when the galaxy is in the center of our galaxy is in your face, forget it, it doesn't work statistically. Pretty impressive, actually. It gets more impressive. If you walk outside and your gaze is straight up, straight out of the plane of the galaxy toward the constellation Virgo, where most of the galaxy is hidden from view, guess what? The right ascension value of that corresponds to this peak. Even more suggestive that somehow, magically, because it doesn't make any sense, physics or any other way, that this should be true. But these numbers sort of line up, and actually this last little peak sort of lines up too, for gazing outward. Subsequently, and I don't have a slide to show you, James has done a lot of work with remote viewing on the internet, and neither he nor I believe this beautiful picture. So it's still an open question. Why are these correlations? It might be just an accident that it lines up here. There can't be anything that we understand coming from the galaxy, like radio waves, for example. I get more radio waves by just rubbing my pants. That comes from the center of our galaxy. So this doesn't make any sense. But it is what it is. And I believe it enough I won't do remote viewing if I have a choice around 18 hours. We won't do them then. Another thing that some of our colleagues have looked at, Persinger at Laurentian University in Canada first noticed that there was a relationship between the geomagnetic field. What that is, if you have a compass and it points north, if you could look at it carefully, you'd see it wiggle slightly. That's called the geomagnetic field fluctuations. It moves very slowly and very slightly. You couldn't actually see it with a compass, but that's the idea. And what Persinger found was that there was a huge correlation, negative, in terms of the literature he found in field work, that things worked better the quieter the geomagnetic field was. So James decided to look at that. This is mostly James's work, and it didn't work. I mean, this is the correlation of versus local sidereal time of the geomagnetic field with remote viewing, and 0 is what you expect, and kind of looks like 0 what you got. And the actual correlation is a little bit less than 0, but not significant at all. But you may notice I've left a big hole here. The reason I left a hole here is for dramatic reasons. For reasons we still don't understand, there is an enormous negative correlation with the geomagnetic field at 13.5 hours. Well, that's reminiscent, because I will overlay on top the local sidereal time graph. Something interesting is going on here. That is not an accident. One of the very few things that work well in our field, Marilyn Schlitz, who's a very well-known experimenter in the States, had done a study with about 10 remote viewing trials and reported a negative correlation of nearly 0.3 with her data. And we said, Marilyn, you've screwed it up. The correlation is 10 times smaller than that. You've done something wrong. And until James came up with this, we understood. Quite by accident, Marilyn had done all her trials right here. So she got about a 0.3 correlation with the geomagnetic field fluctuation. And my goodness, that's remarkable, because it begins to understand mystery that we didn't understand before. Why this should be there, why this should be there, have not a single clue. I'm reasonably confident it's real, however. Now, I think I've got time, yes, to show this. We've been talking about stars, so now I'm going to show you, I think the first ever we did, right? Remote viewing on camera. And some of you may have seen this before, in which case I apologize. And let's make sure the sound is going. This was done for American Broadcasting Company, aired on national television in the States it's called Put to the Test. And it was a real-time remote viewing. And unlike many of the subsequent cases, the National Geographic one being most recent, the folks paid really careful attention to what Joe and I had to say. They spent a large sum of money on this single trial, and let's see if the movie actually works. We have to see if there's some sound coming. Bear with me, please. That should be running. Hang on, I'll do it the old-fashioned way.
Extrasensory perception, ESP. We've all heard of someone who says they have it, and scientists from around the world have spent decades trying to explain it. Well, you're about to meet a man who claims to possess this extraordinary ability and has allowed us to put him to the test. For most of his adult life, Joe McMoneagle was a professional soldier. 2 brutal tours of Vietnam, U.S. Army intelligence, a Legion of Merit award winner, a black and white world, clearly defined and limited to his 5 senses. But in 1970, Joe claims that world was turned inside out. In a restaurant, Joe suddenly felt ill and staggered outside. This is the first time he's told his story on television.
There was sort of a pop, and I found myself standing on a cobblestone road watching the rain go through my hands, and looked up and saw my body sort of half in, half out of a doorway. I knew at that point that I was probably dead.
Joe was rushed to a hospital, where he arrived showing no signs of life.
It felt as though I was falling backwards and was enveloped by a white light.
So here you are, you've almost died, and then all these strange things start happening to you. What's going through your mind?
It shattered all my concepts of reality. I started having spontaneous out-of-bodies. I'd lay down for a nap on the couch or something, and I just find myself suddenly out of my body, somewhere else, totally.
Joe also claims he started having other unexplainable experiences, like knowing what complete strangers were thinking. For 8 years, he kept his extrasensory perceptions to himself. Unbeknownst to Joe, 3,000 miles across the country, this man, Dr. Edwin May, and a select group of investigative scientists were just beginning to study extrasensory perception, ESP.
When I first got involved with this, I was very skeptical. I said, if this is real, it's critically important. After 20 years, I've come to the conclusion something interesting is going on.
How do you study ESP in the lab? Well, scientists developed an experiment called remote viewing. The person being tested is placed in a closed room. A researcher then goes to an unknown location, and the subject is asked to use ESP to draw what that researcher is seeing. Over the past 20 years, Dr. May has conducted thousands of these remote viewing experiments. In 1978, he started testing Joe McMoneagle, and Dr. May claims Joe has drawn scores of unknown sights, 50% of the time with remarkable and unexplainable success.
In one of his best hits, we had a person that was in the administration building at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And all Joe drew was the laboratory, a perfect plan view of what this laboratory looks like. The interesting thing is, Joe's never been to Livermore. And this person could have been hiding anywhere in the entire continental USA. We've looked in the laboratory to figure out what's special about Joe. We've looked medically, neurophysiologically, physically, behaviorally, in every way one can look at a human being. And the good news is Joe is boringly normal like the rest of us. Well, what we are proposing is that there is a sixth, an additional sense, that is responsible for what Joe does in the laboratory and in the real world.
Does Joe McMoneagle actually have a sixth sense, a sense which cannot be explained? To test his abilities, we flew him here to Houston, a city to which he's never been. For Joe, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. The needle, a random location. The haystack, the 5,436 square miles that make up Greater Houston. We hired a movie location scout who spent 5 days finding a wide variety of distinct target sites.
I think all of them have dramatic Houston elements with very defined architectural styles. And, you know, one of the things that I did not want to do is repeat any common denominator. I did not want there to be two archways. I didn't want there to be two triangles in the visual.
Following Dr. May's scientific protocol, the producers reduced the hundreds of possible sites down to 4. A life-size treehouse on the George Ranch. a visually dramatic portion of the theme park Astro World, the Ship Channel at the Port of Houston Authority, and a famous local landmark, the Water Wall. Without Joe's knowledge, those locations were photographed and placed in numbered envelopes at our downtown headquarters. We hired Officer Bill Baker of the Houston Police Department to retain custody of those envelopes. With Joe McMoneagle sequestered in a windowless, soundproof room, we placed the 4 numbered envelopes in an adjacent room. To choose our final location, Julie Wiesen, a local marketing executive, was asked to roll the dice.
So the number is 2. So Officer Baker, why don't you take envelope number 2?
For the test, we selected Jessica Miller from the Houston Visitors Bureau to be what the scientists call the target person. Inside envelope number 2 was the photograph of the Houston Ship Channel. It would be Jessica's job to go to the target site and carefully observe every detail. In theory, through ESP, Joe might actually be able to see the location through Jessica's eyes. We would simultaneously record both Jessica and Joe. So while they drove, Joe began what he calls his cool-down period, meditation, clearing his mind of all outside distractions. After 30 minutes, it was time for our test to begin. I had no knowledge of any of the locations.
We have been radioed that our crew and our target person are now on site. So I'm going to show you a picture. This is our target person. Have you ever seen her before?
No, I've never seen her before.
Describe for us the environment that she's in.
For television purposes, we've condensed the 15-minute session. Remember, these are the 4 locations in the envelopes. But all Joe knows is that the location is anywhere in Greater Houston.
First impression I'm getting is kind of I'm going to call it a river for lack of a better name. My sense is that it's both natural and man-made. So there's probably been something done to this river. It's been dredged or seawalls, formal walls have been put. And the actual target itself is more on an incline.
Remember, at this moment, Joe is attempting to see what Jessica is seeing.
Well, she's looking up. So there's something tall at the target. Keeps looking up at it. I want to say there's like a bridge nearby. My sense is the bridge isn't meant for traffic, it's meant more for people.
As you're going through this process, is this confined just to visual?
Some of it's visual, but some of it's also hearing or smells or taste or just sensations.
Towards the end of Joe's session, a huge cargo ship docked right in the middle of our location, dramatically altering the target site.
I'm just getting a lot of metallic noise. There's something else down here as well. It's a very, very large object. I don't think it's a building. I don't know what that is. But this is a very large object. Something tall behind the part of the entry. And I get sort of almost a specifically designed platform. I get a feeling like there's a black stripe down the center of it or something. This is about probably all I'm going to get on this target.
It was now time to go to the target site. Remember, Joe's impressions included a bridge, a river improved by man, seawalls, a very large object, and lots of metallic noise. When we arrived, we met Jessica, and unbelievably, we saw what she saw. A bridge, a river improved by man, a very large object, and a barge used for dredging.
This is scary. Take a look at that, and then take a look at the barge in the water, and the shape of that.
Which looks exactly like that structure.
Were you looking at that during the process?
I looked at that a lot because I, looked all down in that direction, so I did look at it a lot.
What really impresses me is large object. And I'm looking at this ship, and I can't believe it, because that's right on the nose. Now, in terms of the bridge, you said you thought it was more foot traffic than automobile.
That's obviously something got twisted in the interpretation. Generally speaking, about 80% of what I do say usually turns out to be correct.
Are you pleased with the way this turned out?
Yeah, I'm pleased. I think out of all the places that we could have been around Houston, this is very much fits the picture of the area.
About 20% of what Joe does is as close to spectacular as I could possibly wish. Scientists don't like to use the term miracle very often, but this is as close to one as you can imagine.
Coincidence, chance, or an extrasensory ability that exists in all of us. If you were skeptical, like I was, then perhaps what Joe McMoneagle accomplished today opened all of our minds just a bit. Reporting from the Houston Ship Channel, I'm Bill McAtee.
Joe, you want to comment about that?
That's actually kind of a very good general example of what I do on television, actually.
Now it decides to work, right?
Yeah. What was interesting about that demonstration is when I first got to Houston and I met the crew that was going to do the shoot, Bill McAtee came up to me and said, when he introduced himself to me, he said, "You need to know, I don't believe in any of this. And so when we're doing this filming, it may come across, and I don't want you to be upset." And I said to him, "Well, I don't believe in football and baseball and all that," because he's a famous sports announcer. "And I don't want you to be upset because it may come across in our interaction." So we laughed, and during the actual filming, when we were filming, I had marked on the drawing large object, because I had mentioned a large object that came into the very end of the remote viewing. And then I talked about something else, and I had forgotten that I had marked large object on my drawing. And then I said, "I think that's all I'm going to get on this remote viewing." And so he said, "Cut," and they stopped the cameras. And when we finished the remote viewing and they stopped the cameras, what I'm used to, and Ed will attest to this, when we stop a remote viewing, that's it, it's finished. We never go back and add anything. So after he had stopped the cameras, he remembered that I had marked large object on my drawing. So he said, "What do you think that large object is?" And I said, "Well, obviously it's a ship." So he said, "We need to start the cameras again. I want to put this on film." And I said, "No, you can't." And he said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because in an experiment, a remote viewing experiment, when you stop the experiment, you can't just go back and add things. It's finished. No matter how much you'd like to, you can't add things later." And so I made him understand that there's very crisp beginnings and endings in an experiment. And so we stopped there, and that was the finish of the experiment. So then when we got to the actual target location and saw this Russian ship unloading cargo, he was very upset that we had not put this on film. And he said, "How does it make you feel?" And I said, "Well, that's just part of it. Some things you lose and some things you gain." And he was so impressed by the fact that I would not allow that to be put on the film that it convinced him totally that remote viewing works.
To this very day, he's our pal.
Yeah.
We're almost done. Some of you may object to this term incontrovertible evidence. And my colleagues and I fight over this, and I may be the only one of them that believes this phrase. I believe we do have incontrovertible evidence for an anomaly we don't understand. That is different than saying ESP and remote viewing is real. Something funny's going on here, and I don't know what it is just yet. And I'm willing to go to any statistical length to prove that to any scientist. And I think, in fact, have been successful in other places doing just that. Strong correlation with 3 physical variables, 2 of which I've talked about today. Orientation with respect to the stellar background, that's local sidereal time. Fluctuations with the geomagnetic field, and it's a whole other topic with this, I won't go into it. So if you're going to invent a theory about how all this works, you have to be able to understand precognition, because precognition works just as well as regular remote viewing does. So your theory must account for that. As I said, this is a terrible way to get information, so your theory should be able to deal with very low information flows. Now, we've talked a lot about a lot of secret things, and I'm about to show you a very secret thing, and I need a show of hands so that you all agree you will tell no one. And any reporters here, please put your pens down. This is a very secret thing I'm going to tell you about. Will you all agree, show of hands, not to tell anybody about this future application? I need a show of hands or I'm not going to do it. Okay. A theoretical physicist with powers of ESP stealing a thought experiment from a colleague. Future application of extrasensory perception. Thank you very much. It's been our pleasure.